introduce the next speaker, Dr. Rekha Pai. He's professor in the Department of Pathology, and she will be speaking on genetic screening for pheochromocytoma, susceptibility genes, CMC experience. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So welcome again to all of you. If you're a first-time visitors, take some time off between your scientific sessions and do look at the campus around. It's quite beautiful. To those of you who have already been here before, I hope you have a good time during the next 2 days through the scientific sessions. So now I'm going to take you through something slightly different. Our previous two speakers alluded to large population-driven strategies that are used for screening. So I'm going to talk to you more about a hospital population. I'm going to talk to you about a very rare tumor type, which is the pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma. And I'm hoping to use the next few minutes to sort of convince you that screening, what comes to the hospital, is also absolutely important in trying to identify the genes that may be associated with them and see how treatment strategies or the treatment approaches could change. So pheochromocytomas are catecholamine-producing tumors. They are mainly derived from the chromatin cells of the adrenal medulla. Paragangliomas, on the other hand, are the extra-adrenal counterparts. Okay, and collectively, this group of tumors are referred to as PPGL. From now on, I'll allude to it as PPGLs. And they are, like I told you, they're an extremely rare group of tumors. In our own setting, we may see anywhere between 25 to 30 cases a year. We are a tertiary care center, and 25 to 30 cases a year is a fairly large number in context of pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas. And why has the world suddenly sat up to this very rare group of tumors? It's not that they're sat up only now, they're sitting up only now. For a while, there's been a lot of interest in this group of tumors, one mainly because there is a population within this tumor type where they have germline mutations. And this focus on germline mutations has changed the way we look at these tumor types itself. In addition to that, having found what germline mutations they may have also means that you can actually classify them into subsequent molecular subtypes, okay, and which are referred to as cluster 1, 2, 3. I'll be discussing that in greater detail. And now, based on their transcriptional profile, based on their molecular subtypes, you're able to classify them further, and actually sort of that helps you determine what sort of tumor it may be and the behavior of the tumor. Thereby, there's been a lot of interest generated of late in context of pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas. We've been working with this group of tumor over more than, let's say, 15 years. And I will present some of the data which may be hospital-driven, unlike the previous two occasions where you saw speakers presenting their population-driven strategies. PPGL earlier, I need to start from the very beginning so that I take you along in understanding what this tumor type is all about. Initially, they were classified as 10% tumors. As you can see on top of the slide, we've called it 10% tumor because 10% of them were bilateral, 10% of them tended to be pediatric in nature. Only 10% would turn out to be malignant, 10% would have germline mutations, and so on and so forth. So the whole concept, however, has changed over time, and this concept of 10% tumor is out of the window. No more you refer to them as that, basically because about 40% of them now are known to have germline mutation. And how and why did that happen? Basically because when we were talking of them as a 10% entity, they were just about a few genes which were known to be involved. But over time, more and more genes have been described as so-called susceptibility genes. That means if you're carrying one such gene which is mutated, then it's likely that you will land up with pheochromocytoma. However, the penetrance is not 100%. We'll touch upon that a little later. And also for a fact that if you notice, I've said 10% of them are extra-adrenal in nature. However, today the papers show and the data shows that about 30 to 40% of them are paragangliomas. So where did all this begin? To start with, early 90s, people came up with those with syndromic, those who had syndromic disease, often who tended to have Rett, VHL or NF1 mutants also had pheochromocytoma. That is where the whole story began. People started looking for RET mutations, VHL mutations, and NF1 among those who had PPGL. But gradually, if you look at what happened next, within a span of 7 to 8 years, there were a whole load of other mutants that were described, other genes that were described. The list was expanding at a breakneck speed. So that means that in the laboratory, we were to screen, we were not screening for just 2 or 3 gene types, we would have to screen for multiple genes. Now, doing that is not so easy, as you know, especially if you're employing a strategy which is Sanger sequencing driven. To those of you who work in the lab, who are familiar with this concept of having to go one gene at a time and how difficult it can be, it wasn't a strategy that we were all very happy to work with. So thereby, most clinicians came up with this concept of following an algorithmic approach. If you look at what we have here, for not every patient, we were looking at all genes that is possibly associated. Now, for instance, if it was a, let's say, a syndromic type, we would straight away look for RET or VHL. On the other hand, if it is a bilateral pheo, we would straight proceed to do VHL analysis, and so on and so forth. In fact, over time, this became even more, how would I put it, the algorithmic approach became so complex that you would have to factor in so many things, the age of the patient, whether it's malignant, whether it's a head and neck tumor, and so on and so forth. Even an algorithmic approach started becoming very difficult. At our center, by about 2013, I think, we started looking for all cases of pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma. And our initial approach to it was also to go with Sanger sequencing, and the data is put up here. In 2015, our data was published. At that time, we had only about 50 cases which we could speak about. Over time, what happened is, if you look at the long list that we are staring at, the number of genes associated, so-called susceptibility genes, just exploded, and there were more than about 20 of them which we needed to screen in the laboratory. Now, this made it very difficult. No more could we pursue an approach where we are going one gene at a time and having an algorithmic approach to it. It became a never-ending sort of a testing system, and thereby we had to switch towards a modality which enabled us to look at multiple genes at a time and screen for all of those. So some part of our data is still from the Sanger sequencing driven strategy, while a larger part of our data is coming from the more NGS sort of driven strategy, where using the clinical exome we have screened for almost every single gene that has been listed out here. But I need to actually make a brief statement here. Some of them are somatic. Those which are marked with an S in the bracket are somatic in nature, which means I need to have the tumor with me and work with the tumor to actually establish the type of mutation. We'll dwell on this a little later. Now, you may ask me, okay, there is a condition called pheochromocytoma. There are tumors, so what? Why do we need to really screen them? What if they do have a mutation? Are you going to change your treatment strategies based on that? Now, to answer that, I've just taken out one very beautiful publication that has not so long ago, 2021. This comes with 4 decades of experience while working with pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas, and this is from it's a South American subset that was followed. Now, these people have very elegantly shown that those patients who were found to have a mutation, where the mutation was known, and if they were followed up, it allowed many things. That is, one is better follow-up than the historic patients. It also meant that there's lower metastatic spread because they were followed up very, very closely. The number of times they were examined, their frequency increased. Very few of them were lost to follow-up because they realized they have a mutation. It is better they actually go through the real process of examination which is required based on their condition. And the 5-year survival was much, much better, and therefore the outcomes in such individuals were better. So now I hope I've sort of answered the question of, they are anyway coming to the hospital, you're anyway handling them, is there a reason to screen them? So I felt this should be the basis of what I actually put across our data as, that it is useful, yes, knowing that they carry a mutation, not just carry a mutation, knowing that they carry a particular type of mutation is of certain value. So why is that of value? Not just for a fact that they carry a particular mutation. What has come about, especially if you look at the Cancer Genome Atlas and the data which came in 2017, they have gone on to show that some of these are disease-modifying genes, and that if there is a disease-modifying gene in them, they are likely to have a particular transcriptional signature. If you look at the 3 types of transcriptional signature, which are large blocks in yellow, you have a pseudo-hypoxic signature, you have a Wnt signature, and you have a kinase signature as well. Now, does that mean that knowing a mutation would actually help you to decide what sort of signature it subscribes to? And does that mean the tumor is going to behave differently? Actually, the answer to both are yes. I'm actually taking you first through the set of genes which may be associated with the pseudo-hypoxic signature. The first set of genes that are mentioned there, mainly from the STH family or the STH cluster of genes, all belong to what is called cluster 1A. And the ones which have VHL and EPAS and IDH all belong to what is referred to as cluster 1B. Now, what is the importance of it? Generally, once you get to know that they have these mutations and you believe that they belong to either cluster 1B or cluster 1A, you know that they're going to be fairly aggressive. You know that those are the tumors which are likely to be metastatic, okay, and therefore you can actually devise a closer follow-up for these individuals. Okay, similarly, if you have a kinase signature, when you have a kinase signature, you could have a RET mutation. Often enough, these are associated with RET mutations, NF mutations. They can have mutations which are somatic in nature, HRAS, NRAS, and ATRX. What is of importance here is, based on the mutant type, we are actually able to tell what the phenotype is likely to be. Most of them are adrenal in nature. We are now talking of pheochromocytomas here and not much of paragangliomas. And also for a fact that they have far better outcomes than the earlier group which I had alluded to. Similarly, when it comes to the third group, the third category, this is called the cluster 3 or cluster C. Now here we are predominantly talking only of somatic mutations, which means unless I have the tumor available with me, I will not be able to work on it. We have to have a somatic approach to it, and this is not a blood-driven approach. Finally, what I need to actually point out is, irrespective of what the cluster is, what you need to remember is, once you have identified the mutation, you may be able to sort of predict that this genomic alteration would mean that the biology of the tumor is likely to be like this, or the tumor would be more aggressive, the tumor is more likely to be metastatic, and thereby it sort of gives the clinician an idea of how they could actually look at the tumor and go about the course of treatment. Okay, so I will quickly take you through our experience here at CMCH. Like I told you, we've been working with this rare subset of tumors. Again, to reiterate the fact, we see only about 25 to 30 of these every single year. But because we are a tertiary care and we do see this many cases, we are able to compile and put together all the data we have and sort of share our experience with you. Now, a part of the data, about 80 of those cases were actually handled by Sanger sequencing, which we are calling the retrospective cohort. We also had a prospective cohort starting from the year 2023, when the clinical exome was looked at in these individuals and an NGS-driven strategy was used. I'm trying to actually also use this opportunity to give you an idea that how did the NGS strategy actually change things or change the way we look at these tumors? What did we manage to do with NGS that we could not do by way of Sanger sequencing? Also, there are some definitions you have to be familiar with if you have to take a look at the data that I'm presenting. One, that a given tumor could look apparently syndromic, which means that there is a known syndrome, either in the index case or a family member has been identified with it. There's clear history of having pheochromocytoma, paraganglioma in either any member of the family. So you call them apparently syndromic, and that is where you would classify them. You could also have an apparently sporadic subset where there is no syndromic feature seen in them. There is no family history, but they have come to you with either pheochromocytoma or paraganglioma, and then you would actually place them in this subset, okay? So with these definitions, I think it will become a little easier to decipher the data that I'm putting across. We started with a subset of 145 cases, and if you look at it, a large number of them, 57% of what we saw were pheochromocytomas, 39%. This again alludes to what I had referred to initially. It's moved away from the 10% extra-adrenal category. We now have about 39% of our cases falling in this category, and there were roughly about 4% of them which had both. Also, interesting fact is that a couple of papers have pointed out anywhere between 8 to 12% of their case subsets being metastatic. We had a slightly larger percentage of 14% of our cases being metastatic in nature. I'll talk about it a little later as well. And I'd like to also highlight certain facts here in the clinical profile. If you look at the subset which are syndromic in nature, most of them were cases of pheochromocytoma, which turned out to be fairly significant statistically, and also for a fact that when they were syndromic, they almost always harbored a mutation. So that is the interesting part here. If they were syndromic, they almost always had a mutation. 88% of those cases which were syndromic had a mutation, and it turned out to be a significant association. Again, using our mutational profile, we were able to draw them into clusters. Did they belong to cluster 1A, cluster 1B, or cluster 2? And so these are pointers to the fact that about 18%, 17%, and 15% of those which were seen belong to any one of these two or three clusters, and therefore it sort of guides the clinician on how exactly to look at this tumor type. Okay. Another interesting feature that we found is that VHL still remained, even in our early subset, very early subset, we had about 50% of the cases of, 50 cases of pheochromocytomas characterized, and even in that, VHL tended to be the most frequent variant. Even with a newer approach like NGS, where we are screening for over 6,000 OMM genes, VHL still remained the predominant mutation. SDH was close on the heels of VHL. And SDHB, which tends to be associated with more number of cases of metastasis. Having an SDHB mutation often means that the patient could land up with metastasis, and it is important to follow them up very carefully. The SDH group of mutants which are put up here was a significant number, making up about 15%. Finally, RET was the third in the list. We had a large number of RET mutations as well. Now, in this representation, what I'd like to draw your attention to is the fact that we had some rare mutants which we had never identified in our patient subsets before. For example, FH mutation. Our earlier methodology of screening, which includes a simple Sanger sequencing following an algorithmic approach, did not include many of these genes at all. So for the first time, we are now having some sort of an experience of how patients who have an FH mutation would behave, how patients with an EPAS1 mutation would behave, and how patients, in fact, it's interesting enough, we had 4 patients with MAX mutations, which we've never identified before. And this subset of MAX is a very, very ill-defined subset. Okay, even as the biology of the tumor is not very ill-defined, it is very ill-defined. So that gives us, that's what puts us in a unique place to actually try and understand these mutations. And because we are seeing these patients, it also gives the clinician an idea of how they are likely to behave differently from the rest of the tumors that they normally handle. Again, I have already alluded to this fact, but I'd like to point again, is the fact that those which were syndromic often always landed up having a germline variant. 88% of the time, a syndromic case had a germline variation in it, which was significant. Also very interesting is the fact that 44% of what was apparently sporadic, okay, this is very interesting because not many centers have shown such large numbers of their cases where it's apparently sporadic to also carry a mutation. So 44% of those which were apparently sporadic also harbored a germline variant. Now again, interesting to note that the apparently sporadic ones almost always fell into cluster 1A, and the syndromic were distributed across cluster 1B and cluster 2. So another interesting feature that turned out to be significant is the fact that there was a higher proportion of cluster 1A tumors were found to be non-functioning in nature, and this was a fairly significant finding. Then comes the fact that what sort of, I alluded to the fact that VHL was one of the predominant mutation seen, but if you look at VHL and the type of variant, that is whether it was a large deletion, whether it was a missense mutation, whether it was a terminating mutation, it was not that it was spread across every single thing. I'm almost done. So it was not that it was spread across every tumor type or every type. For example, in hemangioblastomas, which are CNS hemangioblastomas, the predominant type of variant was the large deletion, which we did not find across. For example, in isolated cases of pheochromocytoma with VHL mutation, it was predominantly missense mutations. Again, if we look at the other predominant set of variants, that was the RET mutation. The codon 634, now those of you who follow this line of work, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it. Codon 634 is the most common variant that we find in the Indian region across patients who have medullary thyroid carcinoma. This is something we've reported nearly 17 or 18 years ago. It still tends to be the same. Codon 634 tends to be the most common mutant which you would see in context of RET variations. How do we stand in comparison with the world literature? There are not that many studies. It's not like you have a dime a dozen of pheochromocytomas to follow. Like I told you, it's a very rare group of tumors. But in most cases, people describe something to the tune of 25 to 30% of their tumors to be mutated. While our numbers are slightly higher at 49.6%, I would peg it at around 50%. What is of interest is just above where I have listed our own study data. Just above that, if you look at the CHOI study, this is an interesting part. They have looked at not just germline, but they have also looked at somatic variants. And if you look at germline plus somatic, the numbers tend to be even higher, and that's how they have pegged it at 66%. And their SDHB numbers are particularly large at 27%. That means they need really close follow-up of these individuals because there's a chance of them becoming metastatic. The last point is, am I justified in saying that we really need to screen for these variants? Now, the way I started off by saying is that they're coming to the hospital, they are getting treated. What is the point of really looking for these mutations? One, it allows you to closely follow these patients, especially if they have, for instance, SDHB mutation. They have a higher chance of being more malignant. So it is then imperative that they are followed up more closely. Similarly, you may have a situation where you have a syndromic lesion, you know what sort of a mutation they have, then you can closely monitor these patients. The other point that I have not touched upon up until now is that what if there are asymptomatic carriers? What if there are family members? All these are autosomal dominant. So you have a chance that there is 50% of their first degree relatives who could also be carrying this or harboring this variant. And what if they are asymptomatic? So this gives us an opportunity to not only look at the index case, but to go far beyond that. And just one last word about how did we move? I've already told you we've moved from Sanger sequencing towards using a next generation strategy. And how did that really help us? If you compare our own data set, where we started off using Sanger sequencing, where only about 32% were known to have a germline variant, we've actually jumped forward to another additional 15% getting picked up by way of an NGS strategy. And I've already mentioned the fact that rare variants like MAX and EPAS, which we had hardly ever encountered earlier, have also been picked up. Also, this gives us an opportunity to perhaps in future pick out new and novel associations which are yet to be described. So on this note, I'd like to end this little brief session that I have, and I'd like to not only place on record the fact that we work in a very good laboratory with very hard-working members of the laboratory. There are also a hard-working set of pathologists who I work with, and this sort of effort cannot happen from one single department. It is a combination of a multidisciplinary approach that can only resolve issues of this nature. And thanks are due to the endocrinology department, which has been extremely active. I think some members of it, Dr. Nihal and Dr. Devika, are already here, and they can possibly take any of the clinical questions that come by. Thank you.
Yeah. How do they identify patients with this disease before doing genetic screening?
Before? Sorry?
Before the genetic screening.
Oh, okay. So these are identified because they are severely hypertensive. Devika, would you want to actually take this question? It's, I think, something you'll handle better than I would. You can come here, Devika.
The clinical features, imaging, and the biochemical features. So the history-wise, the patient will have the typical FEO-like spell, means it is the classic triad of palpitation, sweating, and headache. Other than that, they can even have other symptoms like weight loss, uncontrolled hypertension. So that is the clinical part of it. So once the patient presents with these clinical features, then we will proceed with biochemical and imaging. So the biochemical is I do either the plasma metanephrines or the urinary metanephrine. So here we do 24-hour urinary metanephrines. So if it's more than 2 times the upper limit of normal, then we'll proceed with imaging also. So mostly we do CT abdomen with adrenal protocol. If it's other like head and neck tumors, then we'll prefer MRI.
Okay.
See any changes in the protein expressions or any of the specific proteins because of these variants, gene mutations?
Sorry, you're trying to say the changes because of the germline variant?
Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, these transcriptional signatures that I mentioned are all happening basically because of the fact that these are mutated. The transcriptional signature is changing, which means there is either a higher expression or lower expression or whatever we are talking of. In this case, for example, the Krebs cycle related. If you have an SDHP mutation, certainly the Krebs cycle is affected. And then that leads to, that has its consequences. So there is a certain change in these.
Did you find any pattern?
They are all non-synonymous, yeah.
Did you find any pattern like novel expression of the proteins, like so it becomes a distinct?
So let me put it this way. This is only at the germline that has been looked at, and whatever is available as transcriptional profile is known. So none of these, except for the SDHB and the SDH set of proteins, none of them are either followed up routinely because it's of no value knowing whether it's a higher expression or a lower expression. SDHB often used to be used for screening as an immunohistochemistry tool to decide whether that sample should be taken up for genetic analysis or not. So other than that, none of them are screened. But of late, it's become important to look for ATRX, TERT, and NOP10. And that is in the works. We've already started doing it.
Thank you, madam.